So, Joel, I think you can go ahead and take it away.
All right, you can hear me and see my slides?
Certainly can.
All right, very good. So just following up on the game, I wanted to sort of give you some broad principles about adaptation to think about. I know many of you have been diving into adaptation. You're probably quite intimately familiar with these approaches, but sometimes it's good just to go in. And this is sort of as a lead into Rob, who's going to talk about one specific approach, decision making under deep uncertainty, robust decision making. But I just want to lay out sort of a broader framework. The challenge of adapting to climate change is that, and I think as the game so brilliantly illustrates, we can't adapt to a specific forecast. Okay, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in terms of how much warming we're going to get, heat waves, floods, droughts, that kind of thing. And really, at best, we know the direction of change in key variables. But it's not just, and I would just remind you, it's not just a matter of how many droughts or how many floods. It's also the magnitude of these. How severe are future droughts going to be, or future floods, fires, or whatever, hurricanes. When are they going to happen? These are all very challenging things, and if anything, sometimes the consequences are exponential as these impacts get more severe. I'll also just add an observation. Having been in this field for 35 years, we did not, at least I did not expect this to come, climate change impacts to come so quickly and so furiously. It is fast and furious. And that's putting us, I think, all under more pressure to deal with this. So how do we make the challenges really? How do we make decisions about investments with basically with long lifetimes, light and uncertain. It's one thing in the game, you were just making decisions for the decades, but I think as one of the questions was asked was, yeah, but if you invest in drought protection or flood protection, you're probably making, particularly the infrastructure, you're making decisions that have very long lifetime, but even in terms of how you build communities. One thing, the situation is not unique to climate change adaptation. There are other aspects of this that we deal with, and I think there's a path forward, and Rob's going to really dive into that in more detail. Um, Here are some desirable attributes of adaptation. There are a lot of terms here. Flexibility is one, and the thought here is that the whatever we do maybe can accommodate different conditions by adjusting to change. That's not true with all decisions we make. Some things are quite fixed, but other things can be adjusted. We'll talk about some approaches. Robustness, we talked about. Essentially, the implication is that the adaptation can withstand widely varying conditions. Again, not because there are this uncertainty about how much these things will change. Resilience is often used in adaptation. The classic definition concerns the capacity to recover from shocks. Essentially, some shock happens, and then how quickly can you back on your feet? But in the context of climate change, it's also been used to include withstanding shocks. So, for those of us who see how these terms are used, they're used interchangeably in the climate change context. But basically, I think the point is that how do we adopt approaches that really essentially can provide some degree of protection for communities, enable them to continue growing amidst a wide range of potential future climate conditions. All right, so I want to offer sort of three guiding principles here for adaptation. First is what we're talking about, making decisions that work or function over a wide range of climate conditions. What's desired is flexibility, robustness, resilience. We've talked about all those things. Second, consider economics. In a very basic sense, benefits should exceed costs. Talk about benefit cost analysis in a moment. But in a crude sense, yes, this gets complicated when you think about when are the benefits going to happen. If we're planning for events we think are going to happen in a near term, they may have very high implications. The damages may be high. That means we could spend more. If we're planning for impacts that may not happen for many decades, then if you do what's called discounting, essentially think about the present value of future damages, then there may not be as much justification to spend a lot of money. You don't spend a lot now to avoid risks many years from now. I think a third consideration is feasibility. Can adaptations be implemented? The communities in the Northeast, some have considered seawalls and decided not to do it because people don't want to have their view ruined, or they don't want to lose the beach. So these are all considerations that you know, as practitioners will wrestle with. All right. Also, there are some other approaches to adaptation. Sometimes we talk about looking for win-win, otherwise known as no regrets adaptations. These essentially are adaptations that can be justified even without consideration of climate change, but consideration of climate change gives them additional justification. Or low regrets, where you make some relatively small investments that provide some degree of adaptation. It's a low regret because the investment is small, and if it doesn't pay off, you're not so sorry about it. All right, so among the examples of adaptations that satisfy these principles, there can be incremental investments, low cost adjustments to infrastructure. You know, they can buy additional protection, whether it's raising a seawall or building more flow capacity in the storm sewer system or combined sewer system. Those may or may not be low cost, depending on how you do those. If those investments are made when infrastructure is being built or being rebuilt, it may not be that expensive to add some incremental cost. If you go in and do it just to do it, you know, then it's going to be expensive. You can maintain options, buy land on which you might need to build infrastructure, or maybe make some other decisions to keep these things. You don't invest in that infrastructure right now, say some additional flood protection, or maybe moving a sewage treatment plant, or whatever may be needed, but you keep that option open. You diversify your portfolio. For example, water supply. You might look, I think some of this came up in the presentations yesterday. You might look for different, you know, if you're the Delaware River Basin is less reliable. Maybe there are other sources of water you could use, but that also has trade-offs. And use resilient or flexible management systems is another one. For example, water markets can be responsive to changing conditions. You could, you know, raise water rates when water supplies are tight, lower them when you have adequate supplies. That's an example of flexibility, accommodating different conditions. Okay, all of those essentially, and what the game was, these are essentially called these defensive adaptations. They're about protecting things as they are, so people continue to live where they are, continue to have the lifestyle they have, their livelihoods. But one thought that is gaining more and more traction is that, you know, this can only go on so long in many cases, and we may need transformation. All right. In other words, some of these adaptations may not work, particularly if you get very large amounts of sea level rise, very significant changes in droughts or floods. And we may need to think about such things as relocation, maybe changes in livelihood, change in behavior. There's a picture here of Ile de Jean Charles, which is in Louisiana, and that community is not going to be able to adapt to long-term sea level rise, and they're actually, with the help of the federal government, being relocated. But asking people to move, saying, for example, in the West, you know, can agriculture continue on as it has, or asking people to use water differently, maybe not have pools, or, you know, not lawns, that can be politically challenging. And I think you probably know that. So transformation is not an easy thing to do, but it may be necessary, particularly in the long run. All right, so how do we assess adaptation options? We've got two basic approaches. The traditional approaches are essentially help us get to a so-called optimal solution. Deep uncertainty approaches. Now, deep uncertainty is when you're not sure about important variables such as, well, you know, what are future emissions of climate change? How much is the climate going to change? How much are extremes going to change, and when? So you recognize that these are part of the problem, and you try to identify adaptations that work across an array of possible outcomes. So traditional assessment approaches, benefit cost analysis is kind of the king of this, where you express all benefits and costs in a common unit. You seek to maximize net benefits or benefit costs ratio. There's also cost effectiveness, where you might look at how many dollars does it take to protect a life or provide water, and you try to seek the least costly way to achieve a common outcome. Multi-criteria assessment is when you've got different metrics. We might be trading off, you know, economic investments versus human life versus ecosystem protection. And triple bottom line is where you split out financial, social, and environmental benefits. And that can be combined with the above approaches. Now, key thing about these traditional approaches, they work best when uncertainties are well characterized. For example, we might have a probability distribution that we can believe. Okay. You can also apply these to individual scenarios, by the way, but they're not as good when we have deep uncertainty. So, for example, on benefit cost analysis, there's no, you're basically trading off benefits and costs, but we don't have probabilities on greenhouse gas emissions. We're not exactly sure about regional climate change. Again, particularly when it comes to extreme events, we're not sure about timing. But also, how do we make trade-offs of, say, risk, particularly to human health, life and limb over generations? Do we discount them or not? These are all challenges to applying benefit cost analysis to a really complex problem like climate change. So in contrast, we have these deep uncertainty approaches where essentially it's recognizing that climate change cannot be predicted. Uncertainties are going to remain. And with a number of things approaches we take, such as risk management, adaptive management. I'll talk about those. And I've already talked about no regrets, low regrets, and the so-called incremental adaptation. These are other approaches that can be useful under deep uncertainty. Risk management, and by the way, this figure comes from the New York City panel on climate change, essentially is trading off the likelihood and consequences of events. Because as we know, and think of it with sea level, some of those high rates of sea level rise, 2 meters or more by 2100, appear to be quite unlikely. The consequences, though, are extremely high. And so in your decision making, how much can you afford to be wrong versus how much can you afford to pay? But if something is very critically important, may make more sense to plan for more or less likely outcomes because the consequences would be so high. So that's a trade-off you make. Adaptive management sort of says that we don't have to decide everything now. We can design systems or make decisions so that we can in the future incorporate changes in conditions as we observe them. For example, having options to use land for investment in the future, such as maybe building a reservoir or some flood protection. And there are a number of examples of this. The Thames River barrier outside of London, actually they have a whole process where they're making decisions across the 21st century, depending upon their expectations for sea level rise and storm surge. Metropolitan Water District has organized near-term investments in local supplies, expecting that some will need to expand, some will need to be contracted as conditions change. And the American Society of Civil Engineers recommends adaptive management approaches be applied. Other key factors, not to forget, population is changing, income changes, technology changes, preference and culture change. We don't know exactly how these change either, by the way, and we plan for them. But it's also the case that as these things change, these may change our vulnerability to climate change. And you want to factor that in, not assume that everything stays as it is right now. I think another point is think about the decisions you're making. How precise is the information you need? A lot of decisions we make come in increments. So, for example, culverts tend to come in 6-inch to 1-foot increments. I've noticed that decisions on sea level rise and flood protection, such as freeboard, are often made in 1-foot increments. And that means for each increment, there's a wide range of potential conditions that may work. So the decisions don't necessarily require an exact forecast of future events. And before you jump in, and this is repeating the slide that Julie had yesterday, think hard about what do you want to know, particularly I'm on this first bullet, what variables of concern. Yesterday we were at a presentation, it was where's that salt water wedge in the Delaware estuary where you can no longer withdraw water for drinking water. So, and maybe it's some of that, or maybe it's what's the flood level, or how severe the drought is, or whatever it may be. And also, what level of confidence do you need to make a decision? Do you have to have absolute certainty? Does something have to be highly likely? Maybe more likely than not. That may be important when you then look at the science to look for what information will give you. And then looking, of course, thinking about, how are you going to, what data and methods you're going to use, and how are you going to message this is very important, okay? How will you use this information? So the key takeaways, clearly challenge of anticipating climate change is making these decisions in light of uncertainty. There are approaches that are better suited to identify and assess options for adaptation, particularly given these uncertainties, such as adaptive management, risk management, no regrets, low regrets, these kind of things. And other factors besides climate are also changing to be relevant. So you need to take an active role in the decision-making process. It's not just being passive receptors, but tell the scientists what information you need and with how much confidence, and then think about how you're going to use it. All right. So thanks a lot, man.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel. Great. So yeah, we have some time for questions. I don't know if folks have questions, they'd like to raise their hand, or things that we that were brought up during Joel's presentation. We definitely have a little bit of time. If not, we can move on to our next presenter, which will be Rob. Franco, yeah, please.
Thanks for that presentation. I'm really interested in the having just done a lit review myself on adaptation resilience strategies for flood mitigation. I also came across that what I think you call transformation approach, which I know others call complex adaptive systems. I'm just wondering, in your experience, if you've seen any big picture examples of implementation of that transformation approach. I mean, beyond, sort of discussions about managed retreat, but, in terms of sort of operation of infrastructure or decisions that might go against sort of traditional ways of encouraging development in a certain place or in a certain way. In other words, I wonder if you could just say more about that transformation approach, because I think it's really necessary that we talk about it, and I don't see enough conversation about it.
Well, okay, so thanks, Frank. I agree with your observation that there isn't enough. Where we're seeing it probably most is on the coasts, and it tends to be smaller examples, right? Like Ile de St. Charles, you have a small community, you can move them. And the thing I didn't mention in the talk is the buyouts, where places that are being flooded a lot, there are programs to try to buy properties so that, people get compensated and then they move elsewhere. I'm not seeing, but I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I'm not seeing the larger scale analyses of where this is needed. And in fact, even the U.S. government just put out a resilience strategy, but what I've seen in it, I've yet to see a real national strategy about, well, are there places that we need to think about either abandoning or changing how we live there? For example, in the West, I mean, I think, water supply in the Southwest is a serious risk. And, most of the water is used in agriculture. But I'm not seeing strategic analysis of, well, what do we do about that? Can agriculture continue to use 3/4 or 4/5 of the water in the West? So it's hard. It's hard politically because you put certain groups, you put a target on them essentially. You're saying you've got to move, you've got to change your lifestyle, and people react very strongly to that. So that takes a lot of leadership to deal with. But I would say I agree with you. I'm not satisfied with the amount of discussion about these long-term problems that we're going to face one way or another. I think oftentimes what's done is people wait until it's too late. Then you have to do something. It's you're not talking about planning. You're talking about reacting, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's just interesting in the literature. It just seems like there's an observation, there's a self-critique in the literature that we like to talk about the need for transformation, and we talk about it almost ad nauseum, but doing it is a whole other thing. And I think it's just an inch for this group. I think it's really an interesting point.
Yeah, and maybe even just raising it. I think pointing out, gee, we can only do so much, but if climate change comes, if some of these extreme scenarios happen, can we do the measures we're doing, particularly if they are these sort of defensive measures, how long can they last? Is there some point, some level of climate change where it just doesn't make sense to keep trying to protect things where they are and as they are?
An example that I can think of, excuse me, and we worked with this community with EPA's crew team, is Nashville, Tennessee. They have a really interesting stormwater utility that works with, and this was years ago now, so I'm trying to collect the details in my brain, but I seem to remember that they had a pretty significant buyout program where they were looking at repetitive loss structures around, and I'm gonna forget which river goes through Nashville, but around the river essentially. And we worked with them to try to help them understand the benefit to investing in that program further, and whether there was kind of an economic business case for doing that. And so that was a really interesting assessment that we helped with them.
Yeah, and there's lots of approaches. I mean, city of Norfolk, Virginia did a 100-year plan, and it's interesting. They actually identified neighborhoods they thought would face greater risks, I think particularly from sea level rise, and they've planned different development strategies for those neighborhoods. There are approaches like I know some coastal, like North Carolina, some others where, you know, if flooding happens to a property, you can't rebuild at a certain level. So they might essentially force the homeowner to move, or the property owner to move the infrastructure. That then means if you're purchasing property, you ought to be looking at, gee, what are my risks that I might actually have to move this infrastructure. That may make people internalize climate change risks. There are approaches out there, or at least can encourage, where either through planning or through some decision making, you can encourage more of this thinking about transformation.
And then in it, like kind of layered on top of that, is the conversation about equity and what communities those that are in those zones and their ability to really take on that risk, and their legacy, their history in that area. I think that's further complicates it.
For example, buyouts can be a lot more, unfortunately, cost effective in, you know, lower income neighborhoods, because it costs less per home than in wealthier neighborhoods. And do these activities tend to get focused more on communities with less wealth, or that are more marginalized, have less political influence? Yeah, those are important considerations.
And that's why I think the transformation conversation needs to go beyond managed retreat and buyouts, because it doesn't, like, for exactly that reason. Anyway, sorry. Thank you for answering the question.
Well, thanks for the questions. Good point. Yeah, thanks.